Beyond the Drip, a podcast about all things infusion. Super excited to bring you episode 12. Now, this is the first time we've ever had two guests on. And so we're very excited to bring the leadership of IgNS, both the organization and the conference, on. And so we have CEO and founder Luba Sobolevski, and we have Chief Clinical Officer Amy Clarke. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for being on with us.
Yes.
Have our co-hosts on. We have Paula Roth, and Carpenter, and McIntyre, and Brian O'Sullivan. Hey guys, thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. So we are post-summer and now we're in the fall. And for me, this means conference season. So I don't know about all of you, but on the road, the spring and the fall seem like the biggest conference seasons, right? So Luba, Amy, I don't know which one of you want to take this one, but I want to start out and tell you a little bit of my story around IgNS. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
So about 3 or 4 years ago, I was sitting with somebody that was really smart, and I was talking about trying to reach people in infusion. And they said, well, maybe you should think about going to IgNS. And I was like, what in the world is IgNS? And they were like, you should go. I started to look into it. And then, of course, I went. And then last year, actually exhibited. It looks like you're growing like exponentially, right? Like, I guess maybe start with, Luba, it was like, how did that even begin? And how's the last 4 or 5 years happen?
Sure. Yeah, we have been growing exponentially, and we've just been looking at the registration data right before this podcast, and we're up almost 30% in attendance and sponsors and exhibitors versus even last year. And we've been certainly growing very steadily, as you mentioned, for the last decade and a half. So this is our 14th national conference. But to back up, we started this organization because there was a huge gap and a huge unmet need in this industry. And as your listeners and all of you here know, IG therapy is one of the most complex clinical fields in terms of the drug itself, right? Plasma-derived biologic, administered to arguably the sickest type of people, the most complex patients with multiple disease states on board at once. And it's a lifelong therapy. And so huge level of complexity. And we had absolutely no resources for clinicians, standards, comprehensive education available. Everybody wrote their own policies, whichever way they saw fit. We did a benchmark study before kind of launching into creating this association that showed us that over 95% nurses and pharmacists stated that they did receive education, training, competency support at their employer level. But when asked what that consisted of, the answer was reading manufacturers' package inserts and shadowing another clinician. And of course, so the other clinician that they were shadowing had the exact same level of prep. So here we are, right? 15 years ago. This isn't the Stone Age. We are holding our clinicians accountable. We want best patient outcomes. Manufacturers are really putting pressure on the providers to show better patient experience, fewer adverse reactions, all the things. We have nothing to provide to our clinicians to make that happen. And so it was really astounding that we had no practice standards at all. We had diagnostic criteria. We had the dosing guidelines from studies, obviously from registrational trials, but that's it. And so that was the key realization that this is a therapy space that's as complex as oncology and yet has absolutely no support system, scaffolding, education, competencies, nothing.
Luba, take me back to that moment. What were you doing when this dawned on you? Wait a second, this is the Wild West with people's lives, right? Because that's basically what you're saying, right?
So to back it up a little bit, I feel like I was born into clinical medical education before I even had an education in medical clinical education. I worked for a very prominent cardiologist at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center when I was, as I say, growing up and back in the nights, as we say. And that physician, who was a very well-known cardiologist, board seat at the American Heart Association, he started his own association in heart failure. And we created these medical conferences, which consisted of basically crawling around the office floor and putting abstracts together and putting the book, kind of binding it with glue before taking it to the printer. I mean, that level. So started there, really developed a passion for continuing clinical competencies and developing clinicians. Eventually went to pharmacy school, worked for medical education companies in pharmacy school, always knew I wasn't going to straight path into clinical or something that's more traditional. I just could never really settle for just doing one thing, which continues, as Amy will attest to. I think so will my team. And so after pharmacy school and doing some clinical work, I landed in pharma. And it happened to be one of the IG therapy manufacturers. Landed in the immunology field and really had a great run. But while at the manufacturer level, what I saw across the board, not just where I work, which is a great company, but everywhere, the investment into the clinical field was at the prescriber level. Now, rightfully so, it needed to happen. Certainly, physicians are very important. Prescribers are very important. They need education, training, and so forth. But we weren't investing into nurses and pharmacists who were spending the disproportionate amount of time with the patient, who were responsible for the majority of patient outcomes and success of therapy. There was nothing. And at the same time, from the manufacturing standpoint, everybody was surprised. Why aren't patients doing better? Why are there brand switches? Why are there so many ADRs being reported into MedWatch? Why? Right. And the reason is we were leaving this whole, like the iceberg that's beneath the surface of the water, right? It was all the nurses and pharmacists and providers and GPS. Nobody was looking at that. And they need support. They need education. They need standards. They don't know what they don't know. And so when I started IgNS, and that was really the impetus, and I got together a great board of subject matter experts in this field. And Amy was actually one of them. That's how long Amy and I have been together. And I'll let her talk about it.
I got a question though, Luba. So, but do you think there's so many people in our industry that that's the way it's always been ism, right? Do you think that your past in, onco or medical education made you go, wait a second, like it doesn't have to be this way, right?
Obviously, all of us internally have a certain drive and either are more or less comfortable with the status quo. So as a clinician, as a pharmacist, it wasn't hard for me to just kind of leave clinical practice because I knew very clearly I have this chance to impact patients on a more global level. And I didn't know exactly, right? No one knows exactly how you're going to do that. But I knew that I would. So I was at peace with not seeing kind of patients directly. But I think I also knew that, and I was very lucky to find incredible experts like Amy and like a lot of other board members who were all still working together, who knew that to be true as well in their life, in their career, who have seen it. And they were agents of change and they got on this train and they haven't stepped off. But I think it does take the experts and it does coming together. And I think it does also take the right timing, right? The industry was at the precipice of knowing, of doing something else. So certainly pharma was ready to dip their toe and they really listened when we told them how important nursing and pharmacy is. So I think it was a confluence of many things.
Yeah, it's a great story. And I want to get to the conference because it's coming up, right? So, October 16th through 19th, Dallas, Texas. I'll be there, excited to be there. I think it'll be my third one. But Amy, I want to turn to you for a little bit. So you were originally on the board and now you're actually the chief clinical officer. So maybe quickly give us that story. Obviously you believed in it because you were on the board and now, you're one of the gang. So maybe take us through that.
I first administered IVIG to bone marrow transplant patients back in the late 90s. And it was pre-dawn of specialty infusion pharmacy. We started seeing multiple sclerosis where we really don't use IG anymore. We started seeing some neurological disorders. And I began recognizing that how I administered that therapy and things like hydration being incorporated made the difference in that patient's infusion. So I began to intuitively understand things that we now know do impact the patient. I worked my way through a variety of the letters on the alphabet in my career, not by jumping, but by acquisition.
Sure, yeah.
So I was with Chartwell at the time, which became Option Care.
Chartwell in Chicago?
I was DON.
Okay. Yep.
Then I moved to Diplomat. So there's D. And Diplomat was starting their infusion program from the ground floor. Diplomat and Flint, this was their first foray, into infusion. And that's where I met Luba in 2011.
Okay.
I just happened to walk by this booth in the hall where she'd been relegated by whichever conference it was. We sat and we talked for hours. So I began the understanding of what her vision was and what she was trying to accomplish, which was define the IG clinician, define the gaps. What was that needs assessment that got done and our learning objectives as we move forward. And I committed feet first. I've been to every single conference. I probably presented at every single conference. I've been on just about every committee because I truly believe in what this is. Diplomat started acquiring pharmacies, and BioRx happened to be one of them. And I know you know my good friend Randy Broyles.
Randy's been on this podcast, so yeah.
Yeah. So we as an organization believed very strongly in the mission of IgNS, both pharmacy and nursing, which was really, really great to see. So we continued to acquire and grow more sites, more nurses, and then was acquired by Optum, where I remained. So all told, I was there for 17 years from kind of start to finish. And Luba and I talked, and it was time to take our organization to that next level, knowing that what we would then be able to accomplish in educational development and research then grew exponentially by having that vision and taking that leap of faith.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great story. And in some ways, I'm holding back Pam McIntyre here because, as you guys probably, if you've ever listened to our podcast, she's a little bit of our North Star. She's our clinician. We get griping about money and payers and everything, and she reminds us these are human beings receiving therapy. We're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Good point. So, but before we get into that, let's talk just for a second about the conference, just because, I mean, it's around the corner. As we sit here and record today, we're weeks away or so. I'll be there. I know thousands of other people will be there. What do you want to go tell the world? Why everybody in the future, why should people be in Dallas in 3 weeks? I want that from you guys.
Well, if you're doing anything in IG therapy, if you're not at IgNS, you are completely missing the boat. I know this term is thrown around a lot, but it's the term that the manufacturers and industry leaders have labeled our conference with, and it is our IG therapy Super Bowl. It really is. Every manufacturer, whether they're in the rare disease biologic space or IG space or device manufacturers, GPOs, distributors, data management, RCM, tech, clinicians, nurses, pharmacists, physicians, providers, pharmacies, infusion centers. Every sector of our industry is represented. Every site of practice is represented. Every type of clinician is represented. And we really come together for this incredible 4 days of, yes, educate both on the business side and clinical. So we've really developed our business side of both IgNS as an association and reflecting that in our conference. So business, the clinical is both foundational and advanced practice. So whether you are in sales or you're C-suite or you are starting a business, you're starting a pharmacy, or you're starting a business in the infusion space or any other area of our industry, and you're going to work in IG therapy or with this therapy, you need to be there, right? And I think the key, the secret sauce, if you will, for us, because we've grown from, the first conference was like 100 people in 2012. And I thought that was phenomenal because we filled the tables and that was great. But we're expecting over 1,500 attendees this year, probably more. We've been sold out of expo space for a while. We're sold out at every hotel. So these are great problems to have.
Luba and Amy, and I'm looking at your exhibitors, and it's a who's who of infusion. It feels like what began naturally clinical is now everything, right? Like, hey, we got to take care of people. And that's the passion. It's not just clinical, but it's the business, it's the trade, it's the reimbursement, it's how to stay in business. It just feels more holistic. Is that right now?
100%.
Yeah. I mean, we have a business forum, which is one of the pre-conferences this year on the Thursday. And then we have the educational forum foundations that Luba spoke about. But we also have business tracks in the main conference this year. How do you attract competent staff? That's a big issue in nursing. And we've got topics on that, on revenue cycle management, a number of different things, prior authorizations to speak to that growing space that we're seeing, whether it's small startup pharmacies or whether it's AIC. They are all looking for information and best practices in those areas.
Yeah, and there are really two things in play, right? One is, yes, we're all focused on the patient, and we have to make sure the providers and everybody else in the industry can be profitable, because without that, we can't serve the patients. So that's key. And I don't think that takes away from us being a very patient-centric organization. I think it actually enables us to be a lot more effective because we're working with the providers and manufacturers and other industry members and sharing data. And so it's always with the patient in mind, but it has to be holistic. And
I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like the reality is so we have to keep the lights on to care for patients, right?
Exactly.
We have to pay our staff to care, and so it makes sense. And so I think that feels natural to move to Paula Roth, Vice President Extraordinaire of ProChant, Infusion Revenue Cycle Management, one of the best revenue cycle experts I know in the country. PR, I think you can start probably around the conference and thinking about rev cycle, right?
Absolutely. This is really exciting for me, Luba, because I was around right around the time that you started the organization, and I think maybe one of the first conference or so. And as well as there were no standards like clinically, there weren't, those standards there. There were also not in rev cycle, right? So I started my career early in IG, in rev cycle, billing, collecting, working for a national provider, then, go off to a little consulting agency and clients are calling saying, we can't get paid for our IG therapy. Well,
Paula, just for clarification, were you chiseling in stone at that point or was it on papyrus?
yes, we were binding books.
A woman never tells.
Yes. I mean, we were building training manuals with revenue cycle standards around IG and how to qualify a patient. And yes, paper printing manuals and using highlighters and yes,
blood gluing.
Yes, all of that is true. So it's really, even still today though, in 2025, with all of the technology and resources we have, there's still lack of standardization. And from the payer side, those of us on rev cycle trying to figure out, this whole ever evolving clinical aspect of IG, we also have to figure out how to manage that rev cycle process and keep the lights on, as Jon says. In the upcoming conference soon, what are kind of tracks are there for us rev cycle people still trying to figure out best practices and standards?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And this topic has been part of our agenda and part of our education well before we actually created this whole business track within IgNS. And I remember this very clearly, that the two things that surprised me the most when people asked us for topics for next year, because we would do the audience polling, right? And ask what they'd like to see the next year. And it was always the clinical basics, no matter who they were. So we knew we had to reteach that. And the other was reimbursement. And I couldn't believe it because it really, obviously I'm not in that field, although I did some mailing and some typing for a biller at the medical practice that I was talking about before. So that's also a different career path. But it was crazy to hear that there's so many issues, that every claim is denied. There are prior authorizations for everything. And what it took, right? And so we started having these sessions early on. And I know Leslie Bond was presenting all of this very early on. And then we started to bring billing and reimbursement experts to the conference. And we continue to do that. That's a very important part of keeping the lights on, right? And so every single year we have topics about, mechanics of the reimbursement, right? The process for those who are maybe just starting or, and at the same time, we're talking about documentation, the standards, right? We have the first and only legally defensible comprehensive standard of practice that IgNS created, which now also serves as a foundational document for providers to use when they're having to deal with different denials and all sorts of issues. We know this is a very challenging field. And so at our conference, we, as Amy was pointing out, we have tracks. So there are business tracks, there are clinical tracks. And as an attendee, you can go to anything. So that's another beautiful thing. If you are someone in RCM and you want to hear about documentation and you want to hear about how to build a case, what needs to be submitted, that PI patients who are forced to get off therapy to bottom out their troughs, which is clinically ludicrous. And yet here we are. The same thing that happens with patients with neuromuscular diseases. What do you do? How to be the most effective, efficient? How do you build that documentation file, right? You could go to sessions about that. You can go to roundtables. We have 25 roundtables. Half of them are probably business topics like reimbursement and prior auth. And so every year we bring a different perspective, a different leader, and we really listen to our audience after the conference is done. And we take it to account what they wanted us to do following year. And that's kind of a evolution of every conference. I know, Amy, is there anything else I'm leaving out?
No, I think the most important thing to drive home is that we're listening to what's out in the space, where the needs are and the gaps are, so that we can help support the patient journey from getting approved to getting it into their veins and being able to manage adverse events that happen, and as well as looking at outcomes from a clinical perspective in terms of how effective is this therapy for this person.
I think one major thing for us as a conference is our philosophy was always keep it practical. I started IgNS. I wasn't including bench research and about genetic component or kind of the genetic pathways or pathophysiology that goes very deep. Why? Because there are already conferences that talk about it. We need to talk about practice, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same for the business side at IgNS. We're going to give you the problem. We're going to set it up. We're going to give you tools, solutions, and connect you with the right people. So that's key for us.
Paula, that's got to be incredible to you, right? Because you're like, listen, the pie in the sky is great, right? But cash is king. You got hundreds of billers out here billing IG. Like, what else would you ask them as far as, but I love that point of theory is nothing. We have to get paid.
Yeah, I think it's great, helping, like Luba said, is having real applicable to what we're talking about solutions, right? Because we can scour through payer requirements and clinical documents and claim compliance. But being able to get on the phone with payers and negotiate and articulate why it's important for the patient to have that therapy and contractually why they have to pay us and stop denying us, like that didn't exist, when I started this back in the Stone's Age. So having IgNS support us in that way is it's extremely beneficial to providers, also patients, right? We can't take care of our patients if we can't provide therapy. So I think it's great. I applaud you for what you're doing and how you benefit the industry.
That's awesome. I think turning a little bit here to probably a good meat of the section will be Pam McIntyre. Let's talk clinical. Pam, we talk all the time about your heart, and we love your heart here for patients. So you've got two big patient advocate clinicians. This is your podcast. What do you want to talk about when you get Luba and Amy?
Well, I can tell you, going from one end of the country to the other and working with dozens of pharmacies, the thing that strikes me is inconsistencies and the lack of knowledge about the standards of practice. And at their core, they exist to protect patients. We have to protect patients, especially administering this product, life-giving, but also if not administered properly, can be life-threatening. Tell me a little bit, Amy, about how do you support clinicians translating the standards to safe, patient-centered care at the bedside or in the home? And tell me a little bit how misinterpreting them might lead to unsafe practice. And how do you prevent this?
I think the first thing that we need to talk about is standards are only as good as the people who adopt them. You have organizations that are not using the standards. You have organizations that are incorporating the standards, but they have such heavily embedded institutional or individual clinician knowledge that they're not adopting what we provide. At the same time, aren't prescriptive, They are there to provide a foundation of what was developed using evidence-based consensus for those standards. So I guess let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is vital signs, from my opinion. And that's always been an issue from the very start. You first have to understand Ig intimately. So that front part of the standards talks about what Ig can precipitate in an individual, whether they have a subclinical infection or whether they have hypertension, which could then go higher while getting their Ig, and what they're supposed to do. The standards state take a baseline for that reason. Does your patient already have significant hypertension when you arrive? Does your patient have a fever? Which means we don't want to give that infusion until we've talked to the prescriber to see if the benefits outweigh the risk, because they're probably going to feel even crappier if you do. And during at a regular interval, I think is up for interpretation in some organizations. But if you're looking back at what Ig can do and how we educate on blood pressure changes and what your action should be within the standards, that provides a sizable foothold. In addition to that, our conference and what we produce for CECME on our learning systems puts the standards in practice. How do you use the standards to safely administer and monitor this therapy? And it's not what you see in the wild. It's here's what you need to do. And if you see this in the wild that isn't reflected by the standards, you need to talk to your organization or talk to an IGCN or an IGCP who can provide additional guidance. Standards are iterative for sure. All standards are across any discipline. And we make informed changes using the data we receive from patients, from other clinicians, consensus change, which is why we review the standards regularly. We listen to what's out in the field, we look at the data, and we make changes. And we can talk about our P360 and how that informs some changes made most recently as well.
That I'm glad you went there, because I had the opportunity to review the patient guide. Go into that a little bit and tell me you're unique, your organization, and that you solicit input from patients to see, because how do we really know what's going on? You need that data. How is that shaping care delivery and advancing research? And tell us a little bit about how this came about.
Yeah, the goal has always been to provide patient resources, which for us 8 years ago started with the P360 conference. Initially, it was live for a few years until COVID came along, and we didn't miss a beat. We put on that next conference virtually, which was no easy task when you've got 15 different speakers and breakouts and all of those things, and we were all sweating, absolutely sweating. So we're going into our 9th patient conference. The patient conference provides disease state education, therapy education, practical education about financial issues and lifestyle issues, relationships, intimacy, what lab values mean, how vaccines work in your body. All of those things are provided by experts in their field, and also allow that a patient can interact with somebody on Ig therapy who may or may not have their same disease, but it's very parallel to their own experiences regardless. I think anybody with a chronic illness has a very similar experience that goes across just across the board. From that, a survey was developed, and initially we started with Purdue to develop that survey, which is very robust, and we are using it longitudinally. Every year at the same time the P360 conference is happening, we send out the survey to the patients that we have in our database. Bring back that. We want to look at the same patients responding year over year to see if standards are moving the needle. And then we're looking at new patients, and what that data is looking at and begins to tell us is, what is the patient's perception of their care? What is their perception of competency? Asking questions. Does your nurse take vital signs? Do they monitor you after your infusion? And we then are able to look at that data. I'm going to use last year as an example. When we did update the standards, the data showed us that patients' level of satisfaction meant nothing or had no correlation. They could have a high level of satisfaction in the 70s, not your 99 for MPS scores, but in the 70s that did not necessarily correlate to their infusion experience. Leaking at the site for sub-Q, pain, reactions, which to us meant that pharmacy, because these are then pharmacy-only patients, is not following up and asking direct questions about patient experience and identifying things that can be mitigated, things that technique shift might have impacted. So do they need to be re-educated? And that changed the standards where we incorporated that language around monitoring your patient on a regular interval. So if I'm a pharmacy, that's every dispense, asking them if the needle length we're sending is effective or is it causing issues. So I'm really excited about what our research is allowing us to identify, and we're going to be moving into publishing the last several years of data in an aggregate that will be, I think, really interesting across the board. And then from the survey that we did, we realized that patients didn't understand what good care was, what it should be based on the standards. And we went through our standards for clinicians and we rewrote it from the perspective of what a patient should know, how they can advocate for their own care, and how they can be part of that team through a shared decision-making process that allows them to advocate for themselves, which I think is so important. Should my nurse be leaving after they hook me up for my IVIG? The patient guide says no, they shouldn't. So there's a lot of really practical information in there that the patient can take back to their prescriber, they can take back to their pharmacy, they can ask their nurse about, but it makes a better informed patient.
I have a question, and I'm going to ask Pam this question, and then Luba, I want you to answer it, okay? I am usually, particularly in pharmacy, the dumbest person on the call. I don't mind that because I'm a business guy. That's what I am. I tend to come to pharmacy the same way as if you were a person who ran a coffee company, right? I'm all about strategy and markets and profits, and I just happens to be my business, right? But there's nothing clinical about me. But every time I talk to someone, they constantly tell me, I got to get more IG. I got to get more IG. I got to get more IG. Pam, I'm going to ask you, and maybe keep it a little short, and then so we can go to Luba. Are we worried that the profitability of IG and the revenue will causes somehow a bunch of folks who aren't that good at it to jump into it? And is that a worry of ours? Because every time I tell them, hey, do you know how I can get more IG patients? And I ask, do you know how to do IG? And they're like, listen, I can make tons of money, but like, are we worried about that?
Yeah. You wanted me to keep it short. I am, because
very much second that.
Yeah. I go through the standards with every account I work with, but I also try to help them in understanding their protocols and how do you apply this to your patient population? And then I hear, well, we don't do it like that. So it's getting people on board to meet the standard of care for these people that you could truly harm. This is a blood product by nature. You have to assume the same type of injuries can occur. So that's the thing that terrifies me. And I'm going to let Luba pigtail over that because I know she has something to add.
Luba, that's a good question. I deal in business, right? Everybody wants it because of revenue and profitability, but you're a clinician. There's a wild west run on that. But how does that affect? Is that scary to you?
It was scary to me 15 years ago, and it continues to be scary. This was the impetus for starting this organization to begin with, because we had a field that had nothing before. And now 15 years later, we've come a long way. We have a lot of data on that supports the fact that practice has really advanced and patients are getting a much better infusion experience. But to your point, this field is exploding. Is going to double in size by 2032. This is keeping me up at night.
Wait, say that again. Are you telling me that IG field will double in size by 2032?
So it's 17 billion 2024. This is Forbes data, and 36 billion by 2032.
So we know, okay, again, putting on my hat as the business person here, right? I can tell you money is going to look at that and say, let's go into that. And they're not thinking clinical first, right? They're thinking money first. I want the other part of the 17 billion.
I'm thinking that already.
Yeah, I meet people at different conferences, come to the IgNS booth and literally tell me what you just said. I heard I can make a lot of money. Teach me, tell me a little bit about this. Tell you.
The clinician is like,
tell you a little bit about
Where do I start?
I can only imagine Pam's face when someone says, I want to get an IG to make money. And she's like, you're going to hurt people.
At the same time, you could talk to some of our committee and board members who came to IgNS first 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and were starting a small business and learned everything at the conference, connected with everyone that they needed to connect with, networked, really understood the clinical and the business, and are now extraordinarily successful in their businesses because they did it the right way, right? They grew with information, competency, education. They supported their business with appropriate standards, compliance, all these layers, right? And there are a lot of things that we could talk about that we are working on, like ACHC distinction in IG therapy that we're partnering with ACHC on. There are a lot of initiatives that we're putting into the market to support this growth, because without it, it will continue to be the Wild West, and patients will get harmed.
Great segue for sure. Amy, were you going to say one more thing?
I was thinking about this the other night. Pharma for IG is fully aware of IgNS and the standards, and they talk about it when they go into prescriber offices or they go into provider offices of pharmacy and IG therapy. But the challenge with these smaller organizations is that they're going to the Cardinals and the McKessons of the world that aren't letting them know that that information is out there, or their GPO, which I think is a gap that we need to address so that that is addressed when you are providing IG to these little organizations that basically have no nurses with IG experience. They have a pharmacist that's done acute and has never done biologics or IG. How do they know, aside from us infiltrating and broadcasting that we're here, we need partners in that to advance best practice.
To the people that are looking to get into IG directly, prescribers are sending these patients to you. These are clinicians, and your edge in the market is taking the very best care of your patients that you can. And that's how you win.
Exactly.
Yeah, I used to have an old mentor who told me, try to scare the hell out of them, and if they stay, they're the person you want. It's not a bad trait, right? So I think it's a good segue, though, to Brian O'Sullivan Group. Before I do that, I want to make sure I pause and just thank ProChant. ProChant generously sponsors this entire Beyond the Drip podcast. They pay for it. They produce it. They are the absolute nation's best in infusion revenue cycle, led by, of course, Paula Roth. And so thanks to ProChant for doing that. Brian, you lead the O'Sullivan Group. Really, most of yours is credentialing, payer relationships. I'm sure you have a question. I did want to pause and now, because I know how much you care about regulatory and things like that. What do you hear when you hear there's now going to be a ACHC, IG, distinguished? That's a nice thing for an accreditor to do and to help folks in that.
Yeah, I think accreditation standards, if they're specific to a therapy, can really help, distinguish providers and help payers get therapies in their network contracting to the most qualified providers, right? I mean, physicians, we look for subspecialty, board certified, fellowship trained, right? I mean, that there are gold standards there. And to the extent that we can get subspecialties and accreditation, Jon, I think that only helps the patient.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're here, Brian. You stand in between all the payers. We don't like payers very much, but Brian goes and talks to them, even though we tell him he shouldn't. Brian, what questions do you have for me?
First of all, Amy and Luba, thank you for the journey to where we are today. That's a great story. I'll disclose that I remember DOS before Windows. I remember Y2K, right? I'm not a youngster, but to that point of, things happen in real time now, right? And therapies are changing and manufacturers and clinical guidelines. And if you've done a great job explaining, G is really complex at the patient level. So how is IgNS communicating, collaborating with payers about evidence-based standards that then translate into medical coverage and also prior authorization standards so that they're not using a policy that was last reviewed January 2023, and there's a lot that policy is missing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. This field is expanding so rapidly that those of us who are living and breathing it every day sometimes can barely keep up, right? We have not only the growth that we talked about, the expansion. IG therapy has over 100 clinical uses with 7 FDA approved indications, but as a historically supply constrained, not really any longer, product that is plasma derived, it has been used in evidence-based indications based on the pathophysiology of disease. And so we've only recently, probably in the last decade, saw these additional approved indications in a variety of neuromuscular autoimmune disorders, where this product had been used before anyway, right? And so with all these different clinical uses, we have 17 brands of therapy on the market. We have different routes, different dosing protocols, different sites of care, right? It's HCP infused versus self-infused. So there's a lot of layers, and there's a lot for payers to need to keep up. There are a lot of, and all of this also differs payer to payer and plan to plan. And so the best thing that we can do as an association that is central and standard setting in the IG therapy field is to make the standards of practice widely available to providers and to the payers, right? Because as we were talking about before, when these patients are just yanked off therapy for no medical reason, the provider needs to know the data that is legally binding, right? Has the best evidence level of 1A, if we're going to nerd out about levels of evidence in medicine. They can use that in conjunction with literature and all the things to face the payers. And they have the tools. Right? So understanding for us as an association, understanding the barriers that are created by payers because they have a very different objective, right? There's a lot of payer education that still needs to continue to happen. Our commitment is to provide that framework for payers and providers and manufacturers and all the involved parties to get access to best practices, to guidelines, to disease management protocols that are effective and safe and standardized. We don't want providers submitting different types of things, different type of data. It all needs to be very organized, standardized, and that's where we do our best work.
Yeah. That's powerful that you have a gold standard, that you're not looking to the payers to set that standard. Right? Collaboration, right? There's the two approaches, right? Of sort of that antagonistic, right? They're the problem, we're the clinicians, we're all about the patient. But for a payer, the provider's patient is their member, right? So it's the same person. Are there opportunities for collaboration? You mentioned the P360 standards, the certification. Value-based is maybe a little bit overused. I was speaking with a client that has a very different therapy, but they were talking about value enabling, right? Of how do we use pharma and use therapies and standards to maximize the value of care that they're going to pay for, right? Is that something that payers are engaging? Are payers coming to the conference? Which, by the way, this is a great appetizer for the conference, right? I think we're all pumped about the conference and what we're going to learn. But are the payers coming in numbers to the conference to learn?
Well, I think that what you said, first of all, the value-based care is really an important piece to touch on, because we've actually had to define what value-based care actually means within IG therapy, right? We know the reimbursement issues with nursing, so there's little value kind of placed on that, yet that's the component that's responsible for 90% of patient success, right? So identifying what a clinical pharmacist does in the IG therapy space, right? Identifying what the pharmacy or the infusion center, what their responsibilities are. We've changed our standards. We've gone away from being not as prescriptive in our standards of practice to being a lot more prescriptive in certain areas that are key to maintaining the quality of care, where it has to do with competency or specific roles and responsibilities of the clinician. And so defining those in the standards, I think is the first step to communicating the value that each clinician brings to the overall patient care universe, right? So that's why we educate and we standardize care, and we have all of these, we credential clinicians. We don't silo one from another, right? The nursing, pharmacy fields with physicians and prescribers, that is all part of the same universe. And we don't like to silo these things out. So creating value-based model for IT has really been key. And that's been what we have been doing through standards, through staff competency attainment and certification, through identifying what metrics in the patient outcomes data matter, right? So we're not interested in, like Amy was saying, in raw patient satisfaction scores. It's a nice thing to put in your brochure. It means nothing, right? What we're interested in is correlations of patient satisfaction with their tolerability, safety, ADRs, infusion-related issues, adherence, product switches. Why are all these things happening? So that's really key. And we are seeing payers at the conference. They're not front and center. I want to see that, right? I want to see a payer present kind of their view of this. So we can, like we do in our forum between pharma and specialty pharmacy and infusion centers. Everybody was very nervous about putting all these people together and talking about what's really under the hood. And what was astounding to me is that there was how little they knew, how little the manufacturers really knew the business of SP, how the pharmacies really know very little about the business of the manufacturer at a global level. I would love to see payers take a much more active role. I think it'll be a huge benefit. We'll play nice in the sandbox. We always do. But I think it's a huge component. And that education, training, that needs to translate into the payer sector for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add, patients is engaging the payer has historically been difficult for every society. INS has seen it, ONS has seen it. So where our strengths are the empowerment of the pharmacy provider, of the nursing voice, and of the patient, making sure they have the right tools. ACHC standards, the overlay of the IgNS related standards for immunoglobulin therapy do include quality improvement and benchmarking, which is extraordinarily important. You can't have a really engaged conversation with a payer unless you can give them metrics of some kind. So I expect that needle will be pushed as organizations go through the certification process for the distinction and to aggregate data that has meaning. And I know NHIA is looking to establish those benchmarks in home infusion, which has historically been very hard because nobody shares their data. And so I think we're all aware that there needs to be a unified voice to bring to payers, whether they're governmental or commercial as well.
I'm sure.
Let me amplify. If there are payers listening, what Amy and Luba said, you are welcome at the conference. Please come. And then let me de-amplify one thing. If CMS or payers are listening, there really isn't that much money to be made in IGs. It's real narrow margins, right? So don't squeeze the reimbursements. That's all I had to think.
Yeah, don't make it any different than, or at least don't make it any different than ASP plus 6.
Yeah, exactly.
I can tell that Brandon Carpenter's ears went up when the magic word for him. He obviously founded MedEdge, the largest data solutions and reporting company in all of specialty and infusion. So Brandon, we're talking a lot about data benchmarking. What percentage of your business right now is helping people with data and IG? What do you think?
Oh man, probably 60%, if not more. Again, it is a growing segment. I mean, I knew it was growing. I didn't know it was going to double in the next 12 years. It has me thinking maybe I need to go open a pharmacy.
Us first.
And what's that?
Talk to us first. Come to the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've gotten everything I need to know. There's money to be made and it's growing. But yeah, I mean, Jon, when we talk about it, it's a lot of, we help a lot of those folks deal with, hey, I need to keep track of my nursing. I need to keep track of, quality improvements. I remember there was a large IG. They were like, we want to track our assessments on quality improvement and overlay that with hospitalizations and everything and be able to provide those back to the provider so that they can see we're doing a better job. And there's been several clients like that who've wanted to do the same thing. And I think there's been, some discussions here about standardization. What does, that word truly mean? Value-based care, and nobody really has defined it. And it's good to hear, Luba, you said that we've defined it. We've put some standards on what that means, at least in the IG world. So I think, bringing standards to the whole industry is key in being able to then be able to tell your story in a clear, precise thing. Otherwise, what it means for, a large IG versus a small IG is completely different in those types of things. So I'm very interested to see how that helps. And, you talked about NHIA and them trying to get benchmarks and things like that. Way back when me and Jon were at a previous company, we tried to help them, share, de-identified data and those types of things. But I would be interested to see, even for IgNS, how you guys might be able to do that for your members and stuff as well.
Yeah.
I think with NHIA, they might have too broad of a spectrum to tell a story, where you guys are very, much more specific.
Well, NHIA does great work, and we've really had an incredible partnership with them in terms of sharing education specific to IG therapy and bringing them back to IgNS to talk about all things home infusion. So I really applaud what they're doing. Obviously, we are focused on a vertical, right? We just exist in IG and IG adjacent biologics, because a lot of our patients are on these new disease modifying drugs, and they compete with and sometimes are utilized in combination with IG. So our scope has grown somewhat in the last 5 years, I would say. From the standpoint of standardization, obviously that was the biggest thing for us at the start. The standards of practice for clinicians, then it became really the standards of practice for organizations. And same with competencies, right? Standardization of care, right? What each clinician does and how they do it through credentialing, right? And obtaining certification. Our focus for years was on kind of fixing it from the ground up and focusing on the clinicians. And now we have shifted the focus to providers in a very global way. One of the ways in which we've done that is through the ACHC IgNS distinction in IG therapy, which, as Amy pointed out, is creating standards for providers that will include standards of practice, right? Policies, protocols, quality assurance, patient data collection in a particular way, back to our patient 360 surveys and all that research that we do on our side. We want to see providers collect data in a particular way. They can still do what they're doing now, and whatever they're reporting to their key stakeholders, that's fine. But we need to see different endpoints included, so that data has a lot more meaning on the clinical level. And so this ACHC IgNS distinction is really going to provide that new benchmark, that new level of expertise to attain for providers, and then differentiate them, their services, their team, their company, whether they're big or small. So this program will fit with, and we don't need to get into all of the granular details about how it's going to be built. We'll talk about that at the conference quite a bit. And it's launching, by the way, in January 2026. And we have several companies undergoing the pilot right now. So it's very close to going live, which is very exciting. But it raises the level of expertise and allows companies to really differentiate their services at their foundation, what they're best at, with a tangible solution, which, by the way, this program was brought the impetus for developing it was pressure that IgNS was receiving from manufacturers who no longer want to sell their products just blindly into the channel based on, grams and price. Again, safety, derived biologic, there's a lot at stake. And there's a lot of competition. We have 17 brands, and they want to make sure their product gets the best reputation. How do you do that? By appropriate administration, by appropriate care. So they want to be able to have a metric to identify the best candidates who can receive meaning providers who can receive their product, who can utilize their product. We've had pressure from providers the ones that have invested heavily into adopting the standards early on, certifying their clinicians, doing all the right things. They want a tangible title, a metric. They don't want to call it a center of excellence. Everyone is a center of excellence, right? It means nothing, and it's not based on anything. It's like a dispensing hub. Who cares, really, clinically, from the organizational quality standpoint? And so the providers really want this. And finally, patient advocacy groups have a lot at stake. They want their patients to be empowered to select the best within, the ability of them to have choice. We know there's a lot of issues there too, but they want the patients to be, and we do too, wholeheartedly, to be a full empowered decision maker in their therapy. And the patient has a right to know whether their provider has the standards of practice on the desks of every clinician, whether their nurse has ever seen an IV pump before, right? And who the nurse is, really, where did that person come from? And so this really came together from all the different sides of the industry. And we've shared data and we've been very transparent with this program and have gotten a lot of buy-in and feedback and support from every area of the industry. So nothing we ever do is done in silo because Amy and I decided it's a great idea. Although, we're almost always right. I think that the standardization is really coming to the provider level at last.
Right. The onus of competence is placed on the organization, not the individual, which drives keeping up with certain standards because you're going to be surveyed and resurveyed that these standards are being implemented within your organization.
And then you'll have concrete data to show the payer. That's at the end of the day what everybody wants, right? That differentiation outcomes data.
Yeah. And I mean, in addition, we're one of the first organizations working with ACHC that is incorporating the certification of the clinician as part of that, the recognition of organizational competence needing to be supported by those certified individuals.
And that's really interesting. And obviously you talked about, how quickly some of these therapies can change and how complex these are. As Jon said, we've been on the road a lot over the last few weeks. In every conference, there's been two letters that have come to fruition, and that's AI, right? So I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you're seeing that are really cool to see for AI helping out nurses? And what are some of the concerns that you may have, looking, 5-10 years down the road with AI?
So, I mean, AI is doing some great things. It's allowing for data for document mining when you get a large clinical file. It is allowing speech to text for documentation for nurses so that their hands-on care is able to be more of their focus. I think there are some great opportunities in AI, wearables, where AI is monitoring trends of vital signs. The caveat to that is that vital signs have to be taken, and they have to be taken at the right time to make that trend meaningful. And it's only as good as the amount of data that they get. So if you're not taking vital signs, it's not giving you anything valuable. I don't think technology using AI can replace the critical judgment of a nurse in the field. Or even if you are using that data, those trends and other things, there has to be a way to make sure that the data is being validated for accuracy. At the same time, if you build that into your organization and your clinicians don't listen to the AI results, then their license is at risk because the data was provided to them. They just didn't review it, which I think is really important for clinicians to be aware of as they begin to implement those types of things. They have to do something with the data. Where does that data go to inform their care? Those are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. We've already identified the barrier of not taking vital signs or not taking vital signs regularly because your patient looks fine or they're asleep. That they'll think they have the whole picture, but they won't. But I think things will extend the arm of the clinician in a useful way. It just has to be done thoughtfully, and there has to be that validation, as there is with any data. In pharmacy, we do that before we send dispensing data to pharma. They validate that it is accurate. And my favorite word lately is AI hallucination. I witness it occasionally, but let's say all the time, when I ask for a list of articles and I've already told it to check the DOI and make sure the URL is accurate and that it's after 2021, and it will swear right to my face that it is. I double check every single one of those because I don't trust AI to that level. It's a toddler on many levels.
I will add that at the same time, if you think about more high level, what we've been able to do with AI at IgNS in just the last couple of years, we looked at this diagnostic database, and it was our project to improve diagnosis in one of the disease states in primary immune deficiency. We know that there's like 70 to 90% underdiagnosis in PI. The same for many other autoimmune disease in our universe. So as this field is growing and all the things we've talked about, we also have a very significant underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis rate for patients who are taking 10 to 17 years on average to get to a definitive diagnosis in this field. This is true. It's been widely published. What hasn't really been shown is what is the reason for that, right? Why? Where are these patients with these life-threatening infections and hospitalizations? Is it possible that they're not getting diagnosed? And so we did a huge data analysis and trained our AI to look for certain things and compare patients with a diagnosis to those without. And we found that the majority of patients who look like they have primary immune deficiency, don't have a diagnosis yet, are being seen disproportionately by pulmonologists and ENTs. So we had ad boards with pulmonologists and ENTs. That's a whole other podcast. Very interesting data. Why we're not diagnosing patients? Because they don't have the same criteria as the immunologist. You know, to them, 5 pneumonias a year is the patient just has recurrent infection. To an immunologist, it's a huge red flag immediately. Our medical system is fragmented. We know this. And our physicians don't function within the same set of standards, one specialty to another. So there's a lot there. So why not send MSLs into pulmonology and ENT space and all these things that we as an organization can help drive? All of that comes back to our ability now to use AI to look at aggregate data at a level that we were unable to do before because of just the sheer effort and cost associated with it. Now, it took us 2 months to get to the actual raw data and analyze it. And we have a publication in Nature. I think it came out a couple of years ago now. It's great. I think the future is bright, but all the things definitely, all the barriers exist, as Amy was saying, that we're just able to get to a lot more data. And I think help a lot more patients.
And if I can just quickly add the downer, we have an explosion of patients or individuals turning 65 happening for the past decade. It's going to happen for another 5 years. With that comes autoimmunity, secondary immunodeficiencies, malignancies, things that require IG and biologics. And we have a diminishing workforce at the same time that is also heading toward retirement. So AI is absolutely critical to mining that data, that patient information, and identifying those patients quickly.
And it's been a fantastic conversation. I think the most interesting thing to me is both the history behind both of you and where it's brought us today with IgNS, and then where it's going to go tomorrow. So that's super exciting. I want to thank everybody who's participated in it. It's fantastic. Of course, Luba and Amy, thanks for joining us. Maybe every year we come back and do a state of IG, like every year, what's changed year over year. And it might be a great spot for all the Beyond the Drip folks to say, hey, listen and hear from you guys. So, but we're most excited, I think, about being in Dallas, October 16th through 19th, and still got 3 weeks. So those of you who are on the fence, I think you've heard enough to say, get your tail there, right? It doesn't matter where you're at in it. You could be the business side, the sales side, the pharma side, of course, obviously the clinical side. IgNS is going to be a fantastic conference. I'll be there. We're excited to be there. Again, Luba, Amy, obviously all the co-hosts, thanks so much for everything you do. And thanks for starting this organization and contending for these folks that have these diseases. It's really important. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Having us on.
At ProChant, we're obsessed with revenue capture. Revenue cycle management isn't just a back office process. It's the engine that keeps your business moving. That's why we partner with you to keep things running smoothly and securely, from intake to collections, so you can prioritize cash, not the chaos. We specialize in home-based care, combining US-led teams, AI-powered workflows, and transparent dashboards to drive guaranteed results. We leverage over 25 years of experience to optimize your RCM with proven best practices tailored to fit your specific needs. Our expert RCM pros are backed by powerful tech, giving you better efficiency, better revenue capture, and more time to focus on what really matters, your patients. Because when your financial engine's firing on all cylinders, everything else moves forward. ProChant. Contact us now to talk to an expert.